Okay, well, this is quite exciting moment as we have been discussing issues around today around the challenges of the internet, the potential threats, how do we know what's going on, and here we're going to start talking about some solutions. So with that, I'm really very pleased to introduce our speakers for this fireside chat. I'm not sure what the fireplace is, but first let me introduce Dame Melanie Gause, who is Chief Officer of the Office of Communications of the UK, and since 2020, the Chief Officer of Ofcom, which is the UK's regulatory body for telecommunications services, and long distinguished career in public service before Ofcom, which I won't summarize here because it's too much to say, but quite impressive. And then of course as well Tom Wheeler, who's a former chair of the Federal Communications Commission of the United States, and a businessman who has had 4 decades of experience in the field of new telecommunications technologies. During his time as head of FCC, led efforts to adopt net neutrality, increase privacy protection for consumers, and enhance cybersecurity measures. And again, there's more information at the website, at the IDI website. So let me begin. We were just talking a little bit about, you've rolled out a big initiative this week in Ofcom around child safety, and it's been, I think, a big effort and important effort. And maybe you could just talk a little bit about that, because I think it's sort of been an exciting and eventful week, and so that might be a good starting point.
Thank you very much. Being British, I have a cup of tea in my hand. It's kind of 4:30 in the afternoon. I'll try and manage that with the mic. Can I just say thank you very much for hosting us this afternoon. It's so nice, and obviously there's been a really good dialogue earlier in the day, but thank you for inviting me along, and it's always a pleasure to talk to Tom. We've done it before, so I'm looking forward to having a good conversation. So Ofcom, which I am head of, is the UK's communications regulator, and many of you will know us from what we've always done over the years on telecoms and media, and as the UK's Spectrum Management Authority. But 6 months ago, we took on a new role as the online safety regulator for the UK as well, so a different form of media essentially, but also search, pornography services, gaming, as well as social media. And that was because our Parliament passed some very ambitious new laws, which went through on the 28th of October 2023. So we've been getting that implemented, and essentially those laws cover, I'm sure many of you will know this, but I'll just briefly sort of outline it in case you don't. They basically cover illegal harms, around 100 illegal offences and forms of communication that these platforms will need to have systems and processes to address. And then there are stronger protections for children against material that might be legal but is harmful for younger people, and that includes pornography, suicide and self-harm material, hateful speech, bullying, dangerous acts, encouragement of dangerous acts. So on Wednesday this week we published, and we're a regulator, so it's quite a long document, but a very ambitious set of proposals for what we are acquiring from the social media companies and others to improve protection, particularly for kids. And it includes age checks, so that you know where the kids are, where they are, which is not at all currently in use, because we're not talking about just asking somebody what their age is. We're talking about highly effective age assurance. And then once you know who those children are, providing them with a very different experience that starts with taming the algorithms, so that young people are not fed at all suicide and self-harm material and pornography, and violent content and other harmful content gets down-ranked and seriously suppressed on their feeds. And also a lot more control for teenagers. We've done huge amounts of research with young people already. We're stepping up that and doing more, which is quite interesting actually how you do that. Happy to talk about some of that in a moment. But when you talk to teenagers, they feel they've been alone all these years. They feel that nobody's really been listening, that when they complain, nothing happens, that they can't downlike something, they can only uplike it, that they can't block, they can't control whether they're added to big groups when they might not want to be. And so we've really responded to that with some recommendations on that. And I think it's very hard to argue that those things should be in place, particularly for teenagers. So that's what we've done this week, and it's been a really big story in the UK. It's really resonated with parents and children.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know, Tom, if is that something you dealt with at all in the FCC?
Well, let me just, first of all, let me echo Dave Melany's. Thank you for inviting me, David, John. Oh, there he is, hiding back there. And it's a huge privilege to be sitting here with Dave Melany. She referenced this is not the first time we've done this, but the last time that we did this was at the Brookings Institution, and we had a terrific dialogue. And I ended up by saying, I just want to close by saying, thank God for Melanie Dawes. And because she's tackling the kinds of things that few others, we just had a discussion about the DSA and what was going on there. The DSA isn't tackling the kinds of issues. We used to refer to Ofcom, when I was in office, Ofcom was the FCC of the UK, because we had similar responsibilities for the broadcasters, for Spectrum, for, et cetera. And then she got handed this Online Safety Act portfolio that, thank God, I didn't have to worry about. And has done such a masterful job of, October 2023. Now, you and I saw each other, but I mean, when year or so, to about a couple of years ago. When was it? Well, sometime
about a year ago.
And you at that point in time, the Online Safety Act had not passed, and you had 250 people in place preparing for it to pass. Okay, and we heard a lot of discussion in the earlier sessions about regulatory lag and how slow it is to get things going. Here is an agency that was preparing for what was coming so that something passes in October, and in April, you've got announcements as to, actually before then, your phase one, as to what you're doing. I mean, it's a incredibly impressive managerial challenge, but also how she went about it. But I'm going to let her tell you that instead of me stealing her.
That's amazing. I'm curious, we've been just talking about issues of how do we know what's going on platforms. And obviously, in this particular case, there's an interesting question of how do we know that things are getting better? I mean, one hopes the interventions get better. How do we know what's happening on the platforms? How do we know what's happening with children's experiences? Earlier, we've had two conversations. One was around the data access, in part from DSA, and then our keynoter this morning, Helen Margetts, was also talking about what analytic capacity, impressive capacity Ofcom has relative to regulators generally. And I'm sort of curious, first of all, how do you know if things are getting better? What role is there for for external researchers to try to understand what's happening on Facebook or TikTok or what have you?
Yeah, well, look, this is a critical question. Interestingly, when I talk to parents about this, that's the question they ask: how are you going to know whether anything's changed? How are you going to know? It's, I think, the most important question, and it's a difficult one, I'll be honest with you. So, look, you do research first, particularly into the harms and the experiences of kids, and I think the authority with which our teams have done that has been pretty fantastic. And by the way, you're always very kind and say, this is about me, but this is about Ofcom, and we've now got 400 people. And I give huge credit to the government for funding us up front, because it's not usual. Normally, the regulator kind of starts to get going about now. You might have appointed the chief executive about now. So it's, that's why we were ready, is because they supported that. But we've done a load of research. So with our consultation this week is a really comprehensive and very authoritative pack, actually, about children's experiences, which will be applicable in many other countries, not just the UK. So that's the first thing, identify the harm, because I don't think that's been systematically done to date. It's certainly not understood in the social media companies, to be honest, at least not to the metrics that we're interested in. But then as we start to want to see change, how are we going to see that change? That's going to have to be done on lots of different levels. So first, this new set of laws is about systems and processes needing to be introduced. So the first thing will be, have they got effective age assurance? Have the algorithms changed? We can measure that. You can go in and test that in lots of different ways. Are the complaint systems there? Are they working? So we will be gathering all that information, and on the biggest platforms, there are transparency duties. They will have to publish annual reports on how they're doing. We will be providing guidance on what should be included in that. We will be issuing transparency notices to them for them to be required to produce that information. We will be producing our own annual transparency report. So some of this you can kind of begin to get a handle on. I think what is quite nascent still, but what we're trying to build is a more data-based way of measuring prevalence of types of harm for different types of user, for measuring the impact of harm on various different groups. And there, to be honest, it's very early days. And I think so we're building some kind of sort of to be able to kind of particularly scan the system, because we're regulating about 150,000 companies, but we're not going to have contact with most of those. So we're developing systems to scan what's out there in what we call the long tail, and see where we might see instances of for example, CSEA or other obviously harmful content, terror material, so that we can identify patterns and then go in as a regulator. But our partnership with researchers is going to be very, very important. The provisions on researcher access for data are not quite as strong in the UK law as they are in the DSA. We've always argued that this is very important. We continue to do so. The government, I think, is thinking about that here. But I would like as many researchers as possible to be able to join us in the job of kind of working out what's happening and shining a light on things that have been under the bonnet behind closed doors. Giving you a rather long answer.
No, that was fantastic. And Tom, I'm curious in terms of your looking at like the engagement of external researchers in the U.S., like what the prospects are. I mean, what during your time at the FCC, what were they, and now into the future, what do you see are the possibilities?
Well, you start with the fact that there is an asymmetry of knowledge that is designed in. I'll speak for our side of the pond. That the efforts to influence and control the kind of data that reached me as a regulator at the FCC was monumental, including pay-for-play, so-called independent researchers that were far from independent. I went so far when I was chairman as to suggest that, when somebody files an amicus brief at the Supreme Court of the United States, they have to say on the front page who's paying for it. Okay? And I said, hey, what a great idea at the FCC. Let's just have these researchers file, who's paying for it? All hell broke loose. We weren't able to do it. So there is a huge information asymmetry that only the people in this room can deal with. And the great thing, again, about what has been created here and what Melanie is leading is that I don't think that the difference between a teenager in Manchester, UK, and a teenager in Manchester, Vermont, I guess it's Manchester, New Hampshire, I'll get my states right in a second here, in Manchester, New Hampshire, are that different. And there's going to be data that we'll be able to rely on as well. And then, of course, you all have spent the last day talking about how important it is to be developing that data.
I'm curious, what capacity does the FCC have in terms of like seeing what's happening on the internet, what's happening on Facebook, what's happening in Google, what in-house capacity analytically does the FCC have?
Well, the FCC, sorry. The FCC has internal research capabilities, particularly economic and engineering research. Not a whole heck of a lot on behavioral activities. And that's a real shortcoming.
And it sounds like Ofcom, on the other hand, has substantial capacity in this regard.
Well, I think we do have good capacity, and we're kind of broadening it. So, but I'm not going to say, that it's great. I mean, we have some fantastic people, but we haven't got that many of them, not for this task. So I really do firmly believe we're kind of like the cog, we're the regulatory cog, but very much, I think this is something that there will be many, many, many people who are bringing expertise of different kinds to these questions. But we have done behavioural work, for example, and I think this is something that the FTC has also been investing in, actually, in the US. So, for example, a couple of weeks ago now, maybe just before Easter, we published research on mis and disinformation and the sorts of ways that people consume news and how that is shaped by the choice architecture on their services, which is, we would all know, would have an impact. And we've used eye tracking technology to see to evidence what one would guess, which is that what's at the top of your feed you're more likely to read than what comes quite low down your feed, and actually it really is only the things at the top that you're more likely to read. Also that if you're getting your news from social media, you might have quite a broad diet of types of media and media sources, but often a narrower choice of topics because of the way the algorithm feeds them to you. So we've been researching some of that and kind of trying to understand behaviours. We've also previously, last year, published research which shows that if you get your news from social media rather than from other sources, including news aggregators actually, but particularly social media feeds, you're more likely to get stuck in a rabbit hole of a narrower range of opinions and less likely to be able to spot fake news. So we've done a lot of work like that. I mean, I think the question is, what do we do with that as a regulator? And I think there may well be bigger policy moves on this at some point. I don't know, but we feel as a regulator it's important to keep investigating these questions.
Can I pick up on that for a second, Dave, please? So, why doesn't media literacy? Why isn't it sufficient in lieu of regulation? And what's the definition of effective media literacy efforts?
Well, I mean, I would say all regulation in any field, and obviously, we've both of us done loads over the years on, say, telecoms regulation. You can, when I started my career as an economist, which I did in the 80s, that was a world of kind of perfectly competitive markets and all these consumers sitting maximising their utility functions with perfect information. And the idea was that if the information was there, then consumers would logically use it, and so therefore everything was fine, you just had to provide the information. And I think we know that life's a lot more complicated than that. And, people, for all sorts of reasons, just, deal with what they're given and what's available to them. So I don't think that to tackle the problems that we're talking about online, media literacy will ever be enough, because fundamentally the way that social media services are constructed and the way that those algorithms are central to the business model just creates a set of patterns of information that are being given to us, which can cause serious harm. And I just think it's a classic example of a case for standards regulation, which is essentially what the Online Safety Act is. So I would say that you would, at some point in this area, I think standards need to be set. The UK has done that. We are starting on the journey of implementing them. But that doesn't mean to say that, particularly when it comes to news, mis and disinformation, that I think two other really important public policy interventions are required. And one, I would say, is to make sure that you have high quality public service media, which we do in the UK. I think that's very, very important and a priority for public policy. And the other is a really strong media literacy effort, because for some people it has to be hand-to-hand engagement with them to help them to kind of get themselves away from what we know increasingly people will go down into some quite dark places.
And do you start that at the childhood level? And
well, so look, we published our kind of new, refreshed media lit strategy a couple of weeks ago for consultation, given our new duties on online safety. And our role is to kind of research, to catalyse, to share best practice. But it's not to run education programmes. It's not to decide at a community level which groups might need to be engaged in different ways. And what we're saying in that strategy is that this is for everybody. So I just believe in this whole field, there is no silver bullet. You need the regulator, you need PSBs, you need high quality news, you need media literacy, you need education. Yes, for young children, you do, but also for adults. Because people tend to forget it as they get a bit older and need refreshing.
Sorry. Just a question, one more question, and I'm going to actually open it up to the audience, which is for both of you, which is like what are the issues, what are the emerging issues that are keeping you up at night regarding internet and society?
Where do we start?
You do yours, you know where I'm going to go.
Actually, I don't know where you're going to go. I'll say two things and they're related. I mean, one is just ever more powerful AI, Gen AI, but also just generally more powerful AI, which has huge opportunities. I mean, I think in healthcare, for example, incredibly exciting opportunities. But, powerful new forms of technology in the hands of the bad guys can do really bad things. So there are risks, clearly, as well. This is moving very fast. So some of that is relevant to us as a regulator directly, but some of it is just much broader. Raises national security questions, defence questions, and so on. And then the other thing I would say is just, mis and disinformation in the context of our elections this year in the US and the UK and elsewhere. I just think, it is becoming harder and harder for the public to navigate information. And I'm a great believer that actually people want to do the right thing and want to find facts and are ready to know, and do know. All our research shows that people know that what they get on social media, for example, is less likely to be accurate. They do know that. But they also know and say very clearly to us that they don't think they're very well equipped to spot fake news. And this is why media literacy is so important. And I think, you worry about our democracies when that fundamental, question around truth is being challenged. What are you going to say?
One of the fabulous things that you're doing is not only that you are stepping forward in an area where our country has failed, but the way in which you're going about it. And the challenge that I used to have as a regulator was that the companies would come in and say, oh, you can't impose this regulation because it'll inhibit innovation, it'll inhibit investment because regulation is too rigid. And they were right. Okay. The other side of it is they would come in so we would respond and say, well, tell you what, we'll do something that is circumstances based. We'll have a general conduct rule. Oh, you can't do that because that's regulatory uncertainty, and it'll cause, which the real answer was, we don't want any regulation at all. But the point of the matter is that we are stuck with until things that you have done, things that the EU is doing now with both the DSA and particularly the DMA, we have been stuck with an industrial era approach to oversight, which does not work in the fast-paced world of digital innovation. And you have developed a new approach, which is the industrial way of going out is the government comes in and says, this is what you will do, and micromanages. And that indeed does cause innovation and investment problems. But what's impressive to what you've done, and credit to your parliament because they set it up with this kind of a concept, is that you have come in and said, here are the principles that we expect out of you, rather than here's the details of how you're going to get to this. Here are the principles. You're shaking your head. Maybe no. Maybe I'm wrong.
There are some specific measures that we've set out,
Okay,
but ultimately it is a principles-based approach.
And
that's what
you're expected to meet these principles, and we will have enforcement authority to deal with that. And so, the thing that is most impressive to me is the procedural aspect of what you're doing, of what the EU is doing, and how we're finally breaking away from the old industrial model.
Yeah, I mean, the Online Safety Act is a close cousin of the EU Digital Services Act, as you would expect. And, although there are differences in the legal frameworks of the UK and Ireland and most continental legal systems, nonetheless, that sense of balancing fundamental rights and being able to intervene in the way that both kind of legal jurisdictions have is very, very similar and something that's different. It is different from the US context, and I think you're right. It is a principles-based overall approach. Although our codes of practice, we are required by law to set out clear and specific measures that if you take them, then you'll be compliant. So there is a level of detail there as well. But the principles-based approach, I think it's the only way you can do this because of the scale and complexity of the platforms and the information asymmetry.
150,000 companies.
Exactly, and the information asymmetry. However, we're very conscious that this is an unusual concept for US companies to engage with. So that's interesting.
Well, I hope they.
But I want to know what's keeping you awake at night. You didn't answer that question. Apart from jet lag.
What worries me is, for the first time in American history, we have failed to step up to the implications of a new technology and develop expectations for the rights of individuals and the activities of the marketplace relative to that new technology. And we are, and I'm now going to put my chauvinistic hat on, and we are looking to you and across the channel to answer those questions, which is something that, as a person who spent his life in technology in the US, I think is a disappointing development and a failure to lead on our part. But I don't have any strong feelings about it, David.
Well, my more optimistic take is that we have failed often before. So that's a conversation for another day. So let's open it up for questions from the crowd. Sir.
Thank you for the very interesting conversation. I was wondering what are your views of the role of regulators in standardization bodies in particular, because many of the things that regulate the internet and determine how it technically works are not done in places where the influence of parliaments matter directly, but in technical forums where a regulator can participate, as Ofcom, for example, does, but does not have such a strong say as, let's say, in the ITU.
So you want to?
Yeah, I mean, you have perspective on this as well. I mean, I think in the sort of questions of internet safety, we don't have those forums at the moment to really kind of develop global standards. And I think, frankly, from my perspective as a regulator, it'd be great if we did. And it may be that over time that develops. So things like, what are effective forms of age verification? How do you implement them in a way that preserves privacy and doesn't gather unnecessary data, etc. These are all things which would lend themselves to a global technical conversation. And there are plenty of others as well. How do you audit algorithms? What does that mean? How do you go about it? It would be great to have sort of global frameworks for some of this. So over the next few years, maybe some of that will develop. We are, from the UK, with some other countries, there is already a global network of countries that are interested in age assurance, because there are a number of countries that have been trying to put age assurance into pornography providers for a while. So there's quite an active network of cooperation there. So we can share technical expertise, once rather than everybody repeat it. And we also have set up a global network for online safety regulators, which we founded with the Australians a couple of years ago, because they were the first to regulate. And we have a number of other countries, the Canadians are about to join because they're about to legislate. So I think that sense of international cooperation, we don't have it yet, but as far as we're concerned, this is this would be great.
So let me just engage in a little shameless self-promotion here for a second, okay? So I've got a new book out called Techlash, Who Makes the Rules in the Digital Gilded Age? And apropos of the kind of comment I was making before, it suggests that we need a new regulatory paradigm. And that paradigm needs to be built around standards. I came out of the wireless business. How did we get from 1G to 2G to 3G to 4G? We're now working on 6G. As technology evolved and as the marketplace evolved, there was agreement on standards. When I was chairman, I tried to get the FCC at the table with 3GPP and the establishment of the 5G standard. And did until there was a terrible tragedy in November of 2016 in which there was an election and the government changed. And the Trump administration walked away from that. But we need to have civil society, the industry, and the regulators developing agile standards that the regulator can say, here's the issue, here's the plaintiff's brief for what you need to be dealing with, here's the schedule, I'm going to be at the table as well, but I want you to come back in 6 months, 9 months, whatever it is, with a proposal that I get the right to review. So don't give me flowery PowerPoints, and then I will enforce. And so one of the things that I like about the standards-based approach that Melanie is taking is that it begins to move us in that direction. But I think standards, to your point, are key.
And Rebecca, you got a two-finger. This is just a follow-up.
Yeah, I'm really encouraged by the focus on standards. I think that this is really important. But Tom, you just said for me the sort of magic words here, which is civil society.
Good
needs to be
words or
involved.
bad words?
Good words. Civil society needs to be involved. for me, watching the sort of processes that have built around standards building in technology spaces, I see two things happening that I'm a little bit concerned might get duplicated as we're thinking about standards in this space. One is that the commercial organizations effectively have the most power because they're able to put a representative on every committee and every conversation, whereas civil society is just not resourced to do that. And then second, that there's almost a sort of, there's such a focus on technical standards and technical solutions that we lose the sort of deeper knowledge and understanding that's needed from, I'm a social scientist, from the social scientific, but from the social perspective that academic experts in civil society really need to bring to the table in these conversations. Yeah. So I wonder if, how the two of you have been thinking about precisely those sorts of things, dynamics that may have worked well when when we were focusing on technology before, but could dramatically undermine the effectiveness of standardization processes in this new space.
I did a poor job of explaining what I was proposing because I didn't specify that we need to be doing for behavioral standards the same kinds of things we did for technical standards, and that let's just look at the match standard that is being developed right now, so that all the devices throughout your house that listen to you can talk to each other and communicate. Okay, you read through that technical standard, you look at the things they're talking about, and it does nothing about what's the behavioral impact on the people who are living in that house. Okay, and so what we need to be doing, yet that is not to criticize the kind of multi-stakeholder approach that develops a standard. It's just that the standards have been built for the purpose of maximizing the benefit to the technological companies who use those standards. And it's time that we have standards that are built for the benefit of the consumers of those standards. And so I'm just saying, take that model, put it into a behavioral kind of effects-based outcomes, and that's the approach that we ought to be taking. I'm sorry.
No, look, I really agree with that. And I think you need both. I mean, to go back to the kind of standards, the sort of technical standards side, most of the breakthroughs will probably come from big tech companies, just as Microsoft invented PhotoDNA that lies behind still the best hash matching system for finding CSCA. So that we need to encourage that, and we need to find this stuff and then, kind of get it out there. And I think the biggest platforms in particular, who are getting bigger and bigger and bigger and more dominant, have a real responsibility there. And I think they see that actually, but that is necessary. But this is why Ofcom's focus is, because as a regulator, our founding act from 2003 has that our objective is to serve citizens and consumers. We've always been very consumer focused. So we start with, what is it like to use this service? What is the actual experience of it? And I think that has been lost by some of the companies. They bizarrely, they are not consumer services. They are advertising vehicles. They're almost like a business-to-business service, particularly those that are entirely about advertising. And the user is just inside that chain rather than at the end of it in the way that you would expect in a more traditional market. And there's no pricing, there's no price signals, there's very little feedback actually on what people are experiencing other than just whether they're giving attention. So in my view, it's absolutely essential that we harness the user voice here. And in building the capability that we have at Ofcom, we have brought people in from the tech companies, but we've also brought in people from civil society, from campaign groups in the UK who really understand, children's experiences in particular, but also violence against women and girls and some of the gender-based harms, people who've got real experience in terror and hate and how that gets promulgated. So we've tried to build as broad a possible set of expertise as possible. But I think, most public regulators need to keep being encouraged to flex those muscles more, because a lot of things keep you more inwardly focused and inevitably focused on the regulated companies you're working with. Thank you.
Melanie, you talked about having researchers in-house, which you deploy to try and check up on performance of these algorithms, but you are dealing essentially with a set of drug dealers who are trying to maximize attention, things like that. I think of the motoring industry, which of course was gained the regulators in terms of monitoring. So you've got a limited number of researchers. Are you going to try and force the platforms to make it possible for researchers from outside, say from civil society, from academic research, to work inside the tech companies' frameworks to look for problems rather than just have a small group of researchers do it?
Yeah, so just to be clear, we have people in Ofcom, but we also commission a lot of research and with external bodies. So it's not just us doing the research, and the work we've done over the last few years has been a real combination of those two things. So the Online Safety Act has some provisions for researcher access to data that would allow that kind of thing, but they're not as strong as the European ones. So there is a legal question here about researcher access to data, which I think is the real potential groundbreaking change here that would allow the broader research community to essentially play on the data and be able to shine a light on all of this, as I was saying earlier. And, in the US, and you know this much better than I do, there's been, a real challenge from some of the tech platforms against researchers who have been trying to do this. So I think at some level, having provisions in law for it to be done are going to be needed. As I say, the DSA has got a bit more in that than the Online Safety Act at the moment. But it's something we've consistently argued for as a regulator that we think could usefully be strengthened.
If we agree that that most of the conventional media output is now seen and consumed by people on social media, and then the fact that increasingly they are suppressing news material, are we not thinking about a kind of a quota system that would enforce platforms, at least in the UK? Because I think that makes sense. You have the BBC publicly funded. In the US, it would be different. So it would enforce some sort of quota for publicly produced news and enforce it on platforms as one solution against the trend of suppressing news.
Yeah, well, I mean, so the news landscape in the UK is a bit more optimistic than that. So 3/4 of adults in the UK get news from TV, for example, which is regulated and includes public service TV providers, but also other regulated broadcasters who are required to meet standards for impartiality and accuracy and by us. So 3/4 is a high number, and it's lower amongst younger cohorts, but it always has been. And so what you find is as people get older, they tend to turn more to TV and print media anyway. However, there's no question that with each generation, it is getting, and indeed older generations are switching more to other forms of media as well. I mean, our research shows that news aggregators and online newspapers don't have some of the negative impacts that I was describing earlier from social media in terms of getting more polarized, less able to spot fake news. So there are some really good online services there, actually. And, we do believe in plurality and complementing great TV news, increasingly available on catch-up, of course, and on digital platforms with, a whole array of other forms of media. We think that's a good thing, but it just means the audience is more fragmented because there's more choice, essentially, of what's going on. So how do you make sure that the experience is good enough? So, I mean, what the answer is to these questions, I think, is more difficult. What do you regulate for? I still believe that make sure you've got great media, which we have in this country, we really have. Make sure you've got a really strong media literacy strategy, and then think about how you might regulate further the online space. But I think those two things have to come first.
Thank you. Did you add your other name?
Yes, thank you very much. You respectively mentioned behavioural standards and media literacy. So my simple, or maybe not so simple question is there a relationship between the two? And if so, how do you make that relationship real?
In what sense? Do you mean, could you just unpack that a bit for us?
Presumably, behavioural standards affecting people's behaviours are determined, at least in part, by educational approaches, including media literacy. So, is there a relationship between the two, do you feel?
Interestingly, our research that I've referenced a couple of times showing that social media news users are more likely to, go into some more difficult spaces, that is independent of demographics. So it's that we control very carefully for that. So it isn't related to income or background or educational. It's independent of that. It isn't to say that those things aren't also correlated, but it's a result that's independent of that.
Let me try. When I was using the term behavioral, I did not mean the behavior of users. I meant the behavior of those who were providing products to the users and what we expect from them. So maybe that helps draw a line there.
Just one final point. I think media literacy can be aided by platform design. So, there's a lot that can be done to make users more able to be media literate when they're online, whether that's flagging things, whether it's giving them more choice over their feeds, choice over complaining, etc., etc. So we've done a lot of research on that, but outside the confines of the Online Safety Act, which are about tackling specific harms, don't cover mis and disinformation. The Act doesn't cover those things. We haven't yet got to the point of making recommendations on this. And I think, it requires real political appetite to step in on mis and disinformation. It's a contested space, and questions of freedom of expression are really important and quite hard to balance, I think.
Can I pick up on that for a second? Because one of the things we haven't talked about that you are doing is that you're using the establishment of the expectation of standards, the expectation that standards deliver, to avoid having to say, this is good piece of information, this is a bad piece of information. Can you develop that some more in terms of, how are you using the process to protect speech?
Yeah, so you're right. The Act does not say that, it doesn't give Ofcom any power to go in and take down particular bits of information. And so we have a TV standards, radio and TV standards regime in this country, which you don't have in the US anymore. And you can complain to us about particular programs, and we will look at the actual content. That is not the case with the Online Safety Act. So instead, what have we said? We've said you need really good content moderation. You need to train your content moderators. You need to have really good governance. You need to do risk assessments. You must change the way the algorithms work for kids. You must have age assurance for anything that's likely to be accessed by children. So it's those sorts of systems and processes that, the governance side of this we think is really important. And to have, the Online Safety Act requires accountability and governance. And we've said for the largest platforms, we've been quite specific about this, that they need to have proper annual reviews, independent reviews, and so on and so forth. Because we think you have to start with the incentives and do what you can to shape them in a different way. So for us, those are systems and processes too. It's right from there, right the way through to a user experience and complaints and being able to give proper feedback and then get feedback on what you've asked a platform to change. So anyway, sorry, I'm going on a bit too much now.
This was great.
You mentioned before, when you looked at the the services that fall under the scope of the Online Safety Act, there is also this long tail of services that are also into the remit. And I wondered how, if now you're doing a recommendation for the services, for example, in terms of age verification, how would you take into account the fact that some services will be more able to have like a robust, expensive system than others without like compromising the safety of the online ecosystem as a whole?
Yeah, that's a very important question. So what we've done is to have different expectations for larger and more risky platforms and services, while recognizing that some quite big platforms are quite small in terms of their resources. But there are some areas where we've been clear that, you know, for example, showing pornography to under 18s, where our Parliament's expectation is very, 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 very high indeed. That, you know, being small and having low resources doesn't get you off the hook. And ultimately, if you want to offer those services, then they mustn't be available to children, and that needs to be baked into your business model from the beginning. So if you look at our documents, and they are quite long, but there are some quite good summaries, we've calibrated different recommendations for different types of company. But if you've got high risk, then there are higher expectations, even if you're quite small. But it's all out for consultation, and getting feedback on that is something that we need to do, because we are required to be proportionate, quite rightly.
I think we have time just for one last question, John.
Thanks for doing this again. Actually a quick question. What is your reaction to the TikTok ban / investiture? And how do you see that First Amendment national security trade-off that is now being debated in the United States? Love to hear from you both.
Oh, I was hoping I could dodge that question and we could go into Melanie.
Just a quick innocent question.
Well, I mean, we view it with interest. We always love to see what's going on in the US, and I'm heading to Canada and the US at the end of the month. We'll be meeting again, so we'll catch up. And it's always interesting to see how the debate's going on in DC in political circles, and it's very different every 6 months. I always find it. Anyway, but our concern with TikTok is that they need they're hugely popular with kids, and they need to implement the changes that we're asking for. So for us, it's about the service and the users and the changes that we need to see there, rather than about the wider questions of national security and so on. But what about you, Tom?
Gee, thanks, Melanie. I spent the first Obama term involved with the intelligence community, and I think that it is a legitimate worry to be concerned about national security. It is not the first time that we have done something. This will ultimately be decided by the courts. It's not the first time we did something on this. In the Red Lion case in, what was it, 89, right? The Supreme Court held that the FCC had the ability to require a fairness doctrine. And the interesting thing is that fairness doctrine was developed, I guess it was 69, not 89, sorry, was developed like 20 years before, at the end of the Second World War, when two things had happened. One is that the Congress had seen how Hitler was able to use this new medium of radio and film, and they were worried about manipulation. And secondly, it was the time of the Red Scare. And oh my God, if he was able to do that, and we just fought a war as a result of that, and now we have this Red Scare. So it makes sense that we have somebody to make sure that you have to tell both sides of the story. And that was untouched in court review for 20 years. And finally, and when it finally did make its way to the court said, yes, there is, and they invented a reason, which was, well, it's broadcasting. And therefore it's the people's airwaves, and therefore the people have a right to make sure that their airwaves aren't being used for propaganda purposes or whatever. What will be interesting, it seems to me, is as the TikTok case proceeds forward, will the court find a similar kind of nuanced thing that we haven't, none of us here have envisioned to hang or not?
Well, that's a good note to end on, and I also do want to end on just a final, given our audience and a really an incredible day of conference of sort of just I don't know, almost a plea how to constructively engage academic research, enable academic research in these spaces. I do think that there is this potential for constructive engagement that still needs to be fully realized. And so I just want to sort of, I think you're both very constructive actors in the space, but I just also want to make that plea for continuing to push forward in those ways, because I just think we need that sort of neutrality of knowledge production, and there is a lot of capacity to create knowledge in a neutral kind of way. So with that, I just my tremendous gratitude to both of you. This was an amazing discussion at the end of really an incredible day. So thank you.